Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Ray with the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement at Lemoyne College. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon for part 2 of our webinar series, The Power of a Single Ally, Racial Justice and Allyship. I'm pleased to have with us again our 2 alumni presenters, Matt Pace, class of 1997, and Anne-Marie Gardenier-Halstead, class of 1998. Anne-Marie is an assistant professor in the Honors College at Virginia Commonwealth University. She also serves as the coordinator of Humans of RVA and VCU, a program and course in which students learn about the city of Richmond, both in and outside of the traditional classroom. In addition, Anne-Marie teaches honors topics, courses such as social justice and the arts and storytelling. Matt is a licensed marriage and family therapist where a primary focus of his training was understanding the role of multicultural diversity and social justice in family therapy. He is currently a faculty member in the Capella University Marriage and Family Therapy graduate program. He designs and teaches diversity courses and is a member of the Capella University Dean's Council on Diversity, Advocacy, and Social Justice. Along with our presenters, we have returning our moderators. Kukwa Yomape is our Associate Director of Inclusive Excellence in Global Education, and Tabor Fisher is an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Assistant to the Provost on Diversity and Inclusion. Kukwa and Tabor serve as our co-chairs of the Racial Justice Committee at Lemoyne College. Before we dive in with our presenters, I wanted to mention that there will be time for questions at the end, so please send them along via the Q&A feature. And we also welcome your comments, so send them along via the chat feature. I see that many of you are already using the chat and acknowledging where you're from and where you're tuning in from, so thank you for doing that. And so wonderful to see so many of you returning again for this session. And so with that, I'm going to hand things over to Matt and Anne-Marie. Thank you for being with us today.
Hi, everybody. We're so glad to be with you today. As Matt says hello, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are here for the first time, and welcome back to those of you who were with us a few weeks ago.
We are so happy to be with you again, to some of you who are returning with us, and to those who are here for the first time. This is part 2 of our webinar, The Power of a Single Ally, Racial Justice and Allyship. We're happy to be here with all of you fellow Dolphins. Trying to share the second slide here. Here we go. So you just filled out that poll. We thank you for that, and we will be sharing results shortly. Our goal for all of us here today is that we will be active listeners, that we will show understanding, and that there will be no judgment. This is a space for all of us to listen and learn together. If you weren't here last time, don't worry about this next section about homework. It does not apply to you in any way. We did ask folks who were here with us last time to do a couple of things for us for homework, if you will. And one of them was to watch a video, and Matt will say a little bit about that.
Yes, thanks, Anne-Marie. So the first thing we encourage you to do was watch this short video as we introduced some concepts and definitions, and one of them had to do with systemic racism. And there's this wonderful little video, and we will watch that in just a moment. The other homework was to challenge yourself to have a conversation with someone about race. And we will come back in just a moment and talk a little bit more about that. But right now what we'll do is we'll take a few minutes and we'll watch this short video that helps to illustrate systemic racism.
Thank you, Stefan.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Okay, thanks for watching that, everybody. I'm sharing my screen now again, but Matt is still up to discuss this with you.
Yes, so thank you, Stefan. And again, just revisiting this idea. What I love about that video is that it does a couple of things really powerfully. It puts racism in a historical context, that things that happened generations ago impact, experiences now. And I just think that's so important. So as we all sort of watch that, the first thing that we'd like to invite you to do is sort of think about what came up for you as you watched it, if this was the first time you've seen it. And as you think about what your previous understanding may have been about racism and, how it impacts people today, and maybe making a shift between it being something that just happens on a micro level, like from neighbor to neighbor, person to person, to something that happens that is sort of deeply ingrained into our institutions. So Just wanted to encourage folks to think about that. And if you had any comments or reactions that you wanted to share, you can feel free to do that.
Yeah, and as you're thinking and maybe sharing in the Q&A, I'd like to add that there is this nice connection between the sharing in the video about implicit bias and what we heard last time in the Danger of a Single Story video by Adichie. And if you weren't here, I'd encourage you to look that up, Danger of a Single Story. It's a TED Talk, because in that video, Adichie talks to us about the implicit bias that we all have. And one of the things that I think people relate to really well about that video is that it's not preachy. You know, she isn't telling us you all have implicit bias and change it immediately, but she actually shares her own implicit bias with us. And bias comes from all different places, right? And that's how we develop single stories about people and individuals and places. And that's okay. It's part of human nature that we might have bias, but an awareness of it is really important. And if we're aware of our own bias, we can make the conscious choice to go about changing our bias, which is very much connected to allyship, which is what we're all here to discuss.
So if we could think about the homework, in addition to watching this video and having this come up for us around raising our awareness about institutional racism, one of the things we invited you to do was have a conversation about race. And if you can remember the previous poll, which we'll bring that up a little bit later on in our conversation today, we had asked what your comfort level was around talking about race. So we're curious to hear what successes you had in having this conversation. And again, sort of a no judgment zone. So if you weren't able to have the conversation, we're hoping that if you were in the first session, that you were able to answer the poll results. And it's okay, just be honest if you weren't able to have it, but that's okay. If you had it and it was really tough, that's okay too. But we wanted to encourage you to sort of share some thoughts, reactions to even the idea of thinking about doing that, and maybe some experiences that you had having the conversation. So maybe this is a good time to bring up the quick results from today's poll.
Yes, thanks, Stefan. All right, so it looks like 28% did not have a conversation about race, and that would include folks who were not with us last time and didn't know that we had asked people to do that. Nobody said that they had the conversation, it was not comfortable. 13% said that they had a conversation which was somewhat uncomfortable. 44% said it was somewhat comfortable, and 15% said that it was very comfortable. Okay, so a small number of us think that this is a very comfortable thing to do, not terribly surprising, right? These are things that are not terribly common for us to do. They're not terribly comfortable. Many of us haven't done this before, so that is not surprising at all. And Matt, you had mentioned that when we reflect on things like this, it's important for us to think about what comes up for us, right? What feelings, what you do a great job of talking to people about what images even come up for us.
Right, absolutely. I think even so, I think it's really important to reflect on the process, what's happening for us, even when we get to the point where we're contemplating taking an action. When we have the thoughts about taking an action, what happens to us or for us emotionally can either provide kind of a catalyst to do something, or it may provide a barrier and prevent us from doing something. So, I'd be curious to hear what some of this process was for folks who engaged in this. So
I think, excuse me, sorry, Matt. I don't think you can see it because I'm the one sharing my screen, but I can see some activity happening, and I'll turn to colleagues to tell us what people.
Yeah, I was going to pop in because it's Kukwa and my job to kind of keep an eye on what's happening in the discussion. And there's some connections to what you're talking about.
Wonderful.
Many people saw the videos and saw the connection to definitely to economics. But one person wrote that many white folks deny implicit bias because they feel it makes themselves be labeled as racist. And I'm thinking about the role that those kinds of feelings have. And as you were asking, Anne-Marie, you were asking Matt about the role of emotion. I thought it would be, so that's why I popped in, sorry, to bring the conversation about how to have these conversations when your emotions are on the line and your sense of yourself, not as a racist, hopefully. What do you think, Matt?
Mhm. Well, it's interesting because we're going to be talking a little bit later in our conversation today about this idea about being racist or not racist. But just in the moment, it's, in my experience, is a very sort of common experience and reaction for lots of white folks to sort of want to distance ourselves from this word racist. So I think it's an important thing to be aware of. So if someone is aware that that's a scary thing to be associated with, that's an amazing first step, right? And then I think it's important to unpack what that means. And if that's the thing that gets in the way of taking action and being part of the solution, then I think it's important to work on whether or not this word being racist or this idea, whatever it means to you to be racist, is very important to unpack. So, but we will talk a little bit more about this later in this nudge portion of our webinar today.
Mm-hmm. And I would also add, and I think we might have touched on this a little bit last time, but it's very much connected to systemic racism. You know, a lot of white folks, I think, when they hear systemic racism, when they hear white privilege, they might be quick to add, you know, but things were tough for me too. I've had hardships. You know, my life hasn't been easy. I'm not privileged at all. And I think it's important for us to think about ways in which we white folks have struggled, have had hardships, have lacked privilege. It's possible to have privilege in some ways and not in others. Tiffany Jana actually has a great TED Talk about white privilege that covers that very thing, ways in which we are privileged and ways in which we are not. But for white folks, any ways in which we have struggled not because of the color of our skin. I think that's a really important thing to think about when we talk about systemic racism that's really deep in society. For white folks, any kind of hardships that we may have had, and we do have hardships as white folks, for sure that's possible, but it would not be because of the color of our skin. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as well when thinking about systemic racism. Doesn't mean that somebody who is not a person of color has never struggled. It just means they haven't because of the color of their skin. And I think taking some time to reflect on that and be open to that can help folks sometimes too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point, Emery.
Do we have anything else, Tabor, that we want to share from the Q&A or the chat?
There's a conversation about being an interracial couple and therefore having a mixed race child and mixed race actually Black granddaughter. And I think that this comes back to the issue of education, because you could not have the hatred in your heart for another, right? That's not there, but the system itself has worked in that way forever. So even if you are not feeling that way towards another person or a person of color, that doesn't mean that you're not part of the system. And I think it's Maureen is talking about reading and definitely engage in her own beliefs and actions and the way that she's been raised, and therefore helping to educate others.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Kukwa, and thanks, Maureen. Yeah, I think that's a great point about not feeling hatred in your own heart, but still having the need to learn more, to listen to voices of color, to educate yourself. We'll talk more later in the conversation about the great work of Lemoyne's Racial Justice Committee and the resources that they've provided that you can have access to, and some additional resources that we found that have helped us. This is, not something that we can all, be done with in an hour conversation, but it's an ongoing process of educating ourselves. Matt and I want to make very clear that we're not trying to present ourselves as experts who know it all and can hand it to you in an hour. We're constantly learning ourselves, and we're looking to people of color to educate us all the time, and make mistakes. We learn more, and we think that resources are really important as an ongoing way to learn more and to grow. All right, are we good to move on for now? We can come back to more questions and comments in a bit. Okay, great.
I think that's good.
All right, so Matt, this is a great segue to talking about allyship, right? Racial justice and allyship. We raised this a little bit last time, but this is really kind of the focus of the heart of today's conversation is what it means to be an ally and how to do so.
Mm-hmm. Right, so we introduced sort of this definition last time, and so today we Anne-Marie and I wanted to do was, share some of our own experiences with the hopes that it could help folks understand, inspire you to do things yourself. I imagine many of you are already doing things, but we thought we would share some of our own experiences and what it means to be an ally and what it looks like for each of us. And just a caveat is I wanted to share a story is that in no way do I want my story to be one of like holding this up as this is what an ally should look like or should do. And there's even a healthy dose of discomfort for me, even sharing aspects of what I may do as an ally, because I just think it's just something I should be doing and not be praised for in any way. So I just wanted to put that out there. But for all of us, wherever we're at, it's a process and a journey. And I feel like it's a journey that will never end. I'll never sort of reach a destination as I continually try to grow and evolve. And so I'll share this story. But before I do, again, about being an ally, before I forget, something that was also in the video was about this question of, what can we do? How can we help? Okay, so I've learned a little bit about racism and race. I've learned, okay, this is what a textbook version of an ally is. But what does that mean for me? What can I do? And it's a really common place to land, right? So this story is just an effort to sort of show an example of something that can be done. So this is the power of a single sign. And this was inspired, if that's even an appropriate word, by the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of George Floyd several months ago. And I was really struggling with seeing the videos and wrestling with the injustice and the ongoing injustice of this, and really struggling with what I can do. And every day I work from home, and I work from home in the front room where I'm looking at my street. There's a window there. I'm at the dining room table, and I'm constantly watching what's kind of happening in my neighborhood. And in my sort of struggle to want to do something public, make some sort of statement, I decided to create a sign, a Black Lives Matter sign. And I recruited my 11-year-old daughter. Actually, at the time she was 10, recruited my 10-year-old daughter to help me with the sign. And so we created it and put it on our lawn, big sign. And the process that I kind of went through was important for me to kind of reflect on. I was feeling motivated. I was feeling angry. I was feeling like, here we go. There's another sense of injustice in the world. Um, and I thought that I needed to do something that let people know around me in my little universe where I stand. And so it was making this sign. But what I realized for me was that some things came up as I went from the idea to taking action. And it was the heartbeat a lot faster. What does this mean? What about the people in my neighborhood who don't support this? What if I'm targeted? What if my house is targeted somehow by people in my community who don't support this, or who are overtly against Black Lives Matter? And it gave me pause. And then I began to think about my Black neighbors who drive by my house, who have to worry about what happens to their children when they are out in the community, in a way that I never have to worry about my children when they're out in the community. I thought about how, despite living in a predominantly white neighborhood, which is an issue for me to reflect on in and of itself, I thought about how my postal worker is a Black woman. I thought about how, by and large, most of the folks who are doing deliveries on this street are people of color. And so what I decided to do was post this sign for them, so that they knew that they had an ally on the street. So I posted the sign, and some really fascinating things happened. And here's where, as you can see on the slides, we talk about challenges and lessons learned. One of the ways I wanted to challenge myself was to not make this an act in isolation. And so I got this powerful text from one of our neighbors, a Black family, who saw the sign, and she sent me a text, and I'll paraphrase. She let me know how powerful it was and how important it was to them, and how scary it is for them to live in this community, and how fearful they are for their children. I received texts and messages from my white neighbors, and here's where I challenged myself. White neighbor says, "Hey, saw your sign, great job." So my response was, "Hey, thanks, we're gonna make one for you." And then that happened 2 more times. "Hey, we really like your sign, great job." And my response was, "That's great. My 10-year-old daughter and I, we're gonna make one for you so you can put one out on your lawn." And that was a shift for me in going from doing this sort of isolated act to making it relational, to inviting people in and spreading this. And the good news is we ended up with 4 signs in the neighborhood. The bad news is we ended up with 4 signs in the neighborhood. There are 50 plus houses on the 3 adjacent streets here. So it's a lesson for me in stretching my comfort zone and inviting people to take action after I challenge myself to take action. And it's also a lesson for me around how much more work there is to do. So that's the story that I wanted to share. And I know that Anne-Marie has an important story to share as well. Amory, you're on mute.
Thank you, Matt. That was due to the garbage truck that went by my house while you were telling that important story. Yeah, I think it's important that when we engage in acts like this, we reflect in why we're doing them, what inspired it, what was challenging about it, what we've learned from it, because sometimes, you know, these things aren't easy. And, you know, Matt mentions getting the text from the neighbor, you know, thanks. You know, yes, what I did was great. You could just end there. But then what's the next step? And I think those are important moments. Now, for me, the example that I want to share with you is one not unlike Matt's, in that I think it was an act of allyship, but it was one I hesitated about. I had some potential concerns about it as well. And it comes around the same time that Matt's does, though it's not exactly the same. I live in Richmond, Virginia, as I told some of you last time, and this spring and summer was quite the time to live in this area. As you know from the national news, Richmond, Virginia got a lot of attention this summer because of our protests against racial justice and because of our Confederate monuments, many of which came down. Some came down at the hands of protesters, and some came down as a result of the city's decision to take them down. And then of course, Lee Monument, which still stands, was tagged and has been an image that represents so much in our city, and has for a long time. Richmond, of course, was the capital of the Confederacy. It happens to be, the monuments happen to be something that I teach in my Humans of RVA and VCU class. And it is the monuments that are central to the story that I'm going to share with you. Stonewall Jackson was a monument that was chosen to come down by the city of Richmond. And my kids and I were at home this summer when we saw on the news that the statue was coming down. And so we were watching this happen before our eyes, and it was a long process. So we were seeing kind of the early stages of it coming down. And I was sitting with my 14-year-old son having lunch, and we were watching this happen. And it was surreal, awe-inspiring to think that this statue, which represents white supremacy and hundreds of years of oppression, was coming down, and that it was happening just down the road from where we live was just remarkable. And my son, even, I'm thinking this, and my son looks at me and says to me, "Mom, can you believe it's happening?" And you believe it's happening like right there. And he, like, you know, just references down the road. And I said, "I know." And he paused, and then he said, "Don't you think we should be there?" And I said, "Yeah, but," and that's where the but comes, because this was July 1st, global pandemic. The city of Richmond had and has among the highest cases, COVID cases in our area. And that is a point to note because African Americans are suffering with the number of COVID cases disproportionately in our country. And the city of Richmond has a large number of African American citizens. And so the idea that we would enter a crowd of people, because you could tell by the news that there was a crowd of people gathered to see this monument come down, was a bit frightening. Full disclosure, I was a germaphobe before COVID-19. COVID-19 has exacerbated that part of me. I'm kind of an anxious person to begin with, and the germophobia and the pandemic, we had not been leaving our houses very much, which is a privilege. And so while I certainly wanted to be there and to see this historical moment myself and for my kids, certainly given that I teach about these monuments and what they mean to the city of Richmond, it was a scary thought to walk into a crowd like this with a pandemic raging with my children, right? And so I said to my son, "Yeah, I think we should be there to see this and to show that we care about this, right? It's an act of allyship to show solidarity with all the people who have been tormented by these monuments and by what they stand for." And just to give you a little bit of context, the statues in the city of Richmond, and I didn't know this certainly until I moved here, I'm from New York, they line this avenue called Monument Avenue in the city of Richmond. You can't miss them, you can't avoid them. You know, you hear the argument that, well, if you don't like the monument, just don't go to see it. It's not in a museum. It lines a major thoroughfare in the city of Richmond. They are monstrous. There are a couple of monuments on Monument Avenue where if you don't swerve to avoid it, it will take the mirror off the side of your car. I mean, they're monstrous. They are looming figures in the city of Richmond, which is the case in a lot of Southern communities. And so I said to my son very honestly, yeah, I think it would be amazing for us to be there. And we talked about the reasons why. But remember, it's a pandemic and it's going to be crowded. And we might feel unsettled by that. And there's a safety issue. And so we talked about it and together decided that we would go and that we have to be cautious and it would be, crowded and parking and the whole thing. And we went, the two of us, that 14-year-old son, my oldest, who we were talking about this with, and then my youngest, who was and is 10. So we went down. The place is overwhelmed with people and cars. It took us ages even to find a parking spot. And so what we did was we parked, we walked a distance just to get to this area. And we did what we thought made sense, right? We walked in and we didn't get right in the mix of the crowd because I really knew that I couldn't, as an anxious person, handle that. And frankly, it would have been hard to get right in the mix anyway, just because of the number of people that were there. We just hung back a little bit. We could completely see the statue. We could see what was happening. And my kids and I were so glad to be a part of it, witnessing history happen before our eyes. And the feeling of being there, we heard the chanting. While there was chanting, there was also silence in between the chanting. And when you consider how many people were there, it was remarkable that there was any silence, but there was. And there was a sort of energy around it. It was a very diverse group of people. And it was a profound thing to be a part of. And what I found really interesting was that I expected there to be counter protests. We've seen a lot of that in Richmond, certainly over the summer. I did not witness any of that, actually. And it was a wonderful thing to be a part of and to show allyship about the importance of that statue coming down and seeing a removal of everything that it represents. And it's something I'll never forget. I know my kids will never forget it. The conversations we had leading up to going there and then after we left were really important conversations to be had. But I was stepping outside my comfort zone going into a space like that. I have not entered a crowd like that since. But I was inspired by what we were watching on TV and wanting to see it not on TV, but in person. I was inspired by my own kids. And I think we all learned a lot about the importance of having to step outside what feels comfortable sometimes. For me, that was kind of a safety thing, but we did what we could to still feel like we were somewhat safe. And I think that's important. And I add something here about holding space. I'm going to get to that in just a minute, because I think that's important to the overall conversation here. But before I get to that, Matt talked about the power of a single sign. This to me felt like the power of a single act, right? One that felt challenging and uncomfortable, but it also led to the power of a single social media post. And this one also felt uncomfortable to me because I wanted to share with people that we had done this, but I didn't want it to feel like, hey, look at me, I did this really good thing, right? That always feels like a tricky balance. But eventually I did share this story on social media, not just about seeing the statue come down, but also about going into that area where various statues are, and certainly the Lee Monument, which was tagged, because I heard a lot of other people saying the same kind of thing. I'd like to see the statues, but, it's crowded down there. I'm worried about the pandemic. I don't like crowds. Is this really a place for kids? What if the protesting gets out of hand? What if the police show up and all of this? And I had actually been down there to see the statues 3 times, once alone, once with one of my kids, and once with the whole family. And that wasn't entering a particularly large crowd. It was different. But people were avoiding doing that in general. And I wanted to share sort of all of those experiences so that people who were sharing a fear about that would at least hear that somebody else had done it and was glad that they did it and felt that it was meaningful to do it. And so I eventually did share that with people. And what I found powerful about that in the end was that other people said, I'm glad I did that. Thank you for sharing that. Because we can talk all day long about the negatives of social media. And if you haven't seen The Social Dilemma, you probably should, because there are negatives. But there is something positive about sharing something about allyship, about lessons learned that can inspire other people to do that kind of thing too. And I think that was something positive that came out of this as well. But it can feel uncomfortable, like, hey, look what I did. That feels, I don't like the feeling of that necessarily, but it did seem to allow other people to get past maybe their own discomfort to try something like that. Just very briefly, I know we have a lot to get to. I want to read something really quickly here to you about holding space. What does it mean to hold space for someone else? It means that we're willing to walk alongside another person in whatever journey they're on without judging them, making them feel inadequate, trying to fix them, or trying to impact the outcome. When we hold space for other people, we open our hearts, offer unconditional support, and let go of judgment and control. I mention that here because Matt and I have talked about this all being kind of a journey, right? And I think it's important to hold space for people when they're on a journey like this, because we're in different places. But it's also really important when I wanted to share that definition with you and maybe ask you to think about it, ask you what it means for you in your own life, ask for you what it means in the context of all that we're talking about today and that we talked about last time. I thought we'd be remiss not to at least share that with you. I'll turn to my colleagues to see if we're getting any comments or questions as we're sharing these stories.
We are. I think one of them from Mary Ann talks about how it cannot be a single act, right? And it has to be ongoing for the system to change. It has to be a daily journey, like how Anne-Marie mentioned earlier. This also ties into something that Tabor and I talk about a lot, and seems funny, but not really funny. It's given white people always want a cookie. So they want to know that they did something good, and they want the people of color to say, well done, Anne-Marie, well done, Matt, right? And in so doing, they can pat themselves on the back and move on, right? But not getting a cookie doesn't mean that we don't see your work, we don't see your effort. It really just means that we need more than that, right? And sometimes that is a first step, like Matt's Black neighbors, right? So they saw it, they knew they were safe in that spot, but would they be safe with someone else? Would Matt save them if they were not in his yard, right? So definitely not getting a cookie does not mean that you're not doing the right thing, right? It means that it's an ongoing work, and eventually maybe you'll get a cookie, but that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because your life depends on it, even though you've been told it doesn't, right? Because all of the lives of most white folks, they've avoided race, right? And that ties into a question from Brian White on the Q&A. And he says, most of the decades prior to now, it has been about not seeing color, right? I'm colorblind, everybody's the same, we treat them the same, but we've learned in the last few years that equality does not equate equity, right? And the way you treat people has to be dependent on history, on intersectionality. Like it's beyond just everybody's gonna get a cookie, right? So I think Brian is asking, since we've been taught not to see race, and now we're really being pushed to see it everywhere, and as part of our daily lives, whether we like it or not, how do we advocate and point each other, in the right direction? And most of what you will end up doing as white folks is educating other white folks. not turning around and saying, hey, Kukwa, look what I did.
Mhm.
But like Matt said, we will make you a sign, right? But how do you reach the other 46 people? I'm sorry, my phone is talking. How do you reach the other 46 people and make signs for them, or come, visit and make signs with them, right? So I think that's where the rub is. That's where the real work is. How do you talk to other white folks, especially the one closest to you, especially the ones that you are influencing, because that's where the work begins, right? And I think that's what Brian is asking. He says, perhaps what we instill in others is where the real work is.
Go ahead.
I think we should probably talk about that with everybody else before we hop on to the next thing, because the next thing has to do with just affirming the fact that this, I think that Patricia also moved from New York to Texas and saw the same exchange happening with people being really attached to the monument. But I like Brian's question about how do we do this work? Like, how do we point people in the direction of seeing race everywhere? And if they do, then what do they do with that? What do they do with their discomfort? And then once they move through their discomfort, what do they do? Right.
Right. Thank you. I just have to say that your cookie analogy is so spot on, and this almost goes back to the, I'm thinking about this idea of holding space, and I'm thinking about what came up very early on in our conversation about the word racism or being called a racist. And so I feel like these are all interconnected. So I think a lot of white people early in this journey are anxious about, am I a good person? If I'm a good person, I can't be racist. If I'm racist, I can't be a good person. So if you call me a racist, it really makes these worlds collide. If I am asking a person of color to make me feel better about how I am racist, then I'm asking that person of color to take on my anxiety about that. And this idea of holding space that Anne-Marie talked about, a huge part of that is holding on to our own anxiety about what does this mean about me and who I am, and am I a good person? Am I racist? Can those things coexist? So that was just wonderfully illustrated, Kukwa. To Brian's question, for me, it's about acknowledging race. Acknowledging differences and diversity can be a wonderful thing. So the idea of being colorblind and not seeing race, I think we need to put that to sleep, and we need to continue to talk about how race is influencing all of us. It's part of the air we breathe. And so I think that's the direction to continue to go in, acknowledging that these things exist. That's a huge part of dismantling the system.
I would add just a couple of things to that. I think one thing to do is just to continue to educate ourselves, to listen to voices of color, to listen more and talk less, to try to educate fellow white people. So it's the educating fellow white people, listening to voices of color. One thing that I think that hopefully a lot of us learned, maybe more recently than ever before, is the importance of listening to voices of color that have been screaming at us for a really long time, right? I think it was Matt who said last time that we wanted to acknowledge that we're not going to say anything that hasn't been said before by voices of color for hundreds of years. This is not brand new information. We've created nothing here, right? We're just trying to reiterate it so that hopefully as people hear it again and again and again, it'll sink in, it'll register. But these are not our original ideas, right? We learn from voices of color about these things, and we want to continue to share them, and so that more people can learn. It is more appropriate, I think, that rather than ask our friends of color, to teach us this information, that we look to existing voices, readings, videos, films, podcasts that already exist and not put the burden on people of color to re-educate us, because that information already exists and it's been around for a really long time. And in fact, we're going to share resources with you today. And in fact, the colorblindness question, Brian, we're sharing a great resource with you in our list, I think, that is about colorblindness. And right in the title, it says that colorblindness is a barrier to dismantling racism, that we have to recognize race and racism in order to dismantle it, right? Because it does exist, and that systemic racism is so key to understanding racism and how to dismantle it, right? We have to start with an understanding of it and an acknowledgement of it. And in fact, I know that these questions are great and we're running out of time. So we won't share the readings and the podcasts and everything that we have on our slides. We'll send them to you later. I think maybe from here, a good place is to jump quickly, Matt, to what it means to be anti-racist as opposed to not racist. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, let's do that. So that way we have a few more minutes left. And I think what I'll do is this speaks to this idea of racist or not racist. This would help solve that problem. And I'll read this quote by Kendi. "There is no neutrality in the racism struggle. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist, or confronts racial inequalities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism." Now here's that nudge. For a lot of folks, this will be a really difficult thing to try to sort of make sense of, because in my experience, in my own personal experience, I would have called myself not racist. That's just not true for me anymore. So we'll just pose this, I think, because of time, just as a challenge to resign from your position of an innocent bystander, to imagine that can't exist. If any of us are interested in social justice, then we cannot be innocent bystanders or silent bystanders at all. And so we just want to encourage you to wrestle with that. Think about that. What does that mean to you? And if that can be true for you, then you're either racist or you're anti-racist. And think about that. Wrestle with that.
And I would just point to another great quote here that gets at the issue of neutrality and silence. The fact that we are here and that I speak these words is an attempt to break that silence and bridge some of those differences between us. For it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. And Matt mentions the innocent bystander. I think so often we sit in silence, and silence is the language of the oppressor. You've probably heard that, right? How do we go from silence or from thinking and talking about things to action, to acts of allyship, to being an ally, right? And as Kukla mentioned from the chatter, the Q&A, it's not one act, right? It's not thinking about acts. It's about this daily practice of acts of allyship, of practicing anti-racism, which is the supporting and instituting policies and ideas that level racial inequalities. It's a journey, right? So for those of you who said that you didn't have a conversation about race or that it was very uncomfortable, that's okay, because it's a process, but we need to continue working at it, right? If we want to be anti-racist, if we want to be allies, and that's really the only way in order for us to level those inequalities, in order for us to dismantle systemic racism. And we hope that the resources that we put together for you, in addition to what Lemoyne's Racial Justice Committee has done, will be useful along the way.
Would now be a good time to show this really wonderful message as part of our thank you to Lemoyne for creating space. It's the very thing that creating the space for a conversation like this is an act of allyship. And there's a wonderful message that the Alumni Association has created that we thought was really pertinent to share here with you all.
Thanks, Stefan.
For many of us, our thoughts of Lemoyne College are filled with memories of friendship, community, and personal growth.
But for students and alumni of color from the 1960s through today, those same experiences have been marked with feelings of marginalization, isolation, and at times outright hostility.
That these experiences have not changed over several decades at Lemoyne reveals an uncomfortable truth.
For far too long, both as students and alumni,
many of us fail to recognize, confront, and address institutional and personal racism as it was made evident at Lemoyne.
The Lemoyne Alumni Association Board fully supports steps announced by President Lemira in her June 17th message to the Lemoyne community.
We are announcing our own initiatives to continue learning, understanding, and changing the experience of students and alumni of color.
There's a lot of work and many uncomfortable conversations ahead of us. But there is also the opportunity to build a Lemoyne that fully realizes its aspirations as a beacon of social justice.
join us.
Share your stories with us.
And help us advance this critically important work by emailing the Alumni Association Board.
As a board, we have taken the time to start having conversations, auditing influences that impact our perspectives, and have learned more, gained more, and aspire to more.
Our commitment is that we will not stop here. This is just the beginning of our collective journey to grow closer, not in spite of our differences, but because of them.
Thanks, everybody. Matt and I just want to thank the Alumni Association for that video and to Lemoyne for inviting us and for being part of the solution with webinars like this and with videos like that.
Yeah, ditto to that. Thanks, everyone. And go out there and do some good work.
Anne-Marie, Matt, thank you so much again for your presentations. I thought it was very powerful and so great to have you back for 2 sessions. Kukwa and Timothy as well for offering context and additional insight into the work you're doing here too. Thank you all for being here. We will be sending resources of the presentation after this, so be on the lookout for an email with that. Additionally, I wanted to let you know that we will be offering more webinars next year as we celebrate our 75th anniversary of Lemoyne. So there's going to be webinars on women of Lemoyne, racial justice, and continued social justice of Lemoyne, and many other topics. So stay tuned for those as well. And also we are hosting our Lessons and Carols event this Sunday. So stay tuned for the premiere of that on our YouTube page. That'll be a Sunday at 7 p.m. So you don't want to miss that. And again, thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate having you, and have a happy and wonderful holiday season, everyone.
Thank you.